happens in Visual Basic. So if we set this to false, and then we start up the site again in the debug mode, we'll see we get the blank page and we did not hit the breakpoint in the page load method. So since the framework is not automatically wiring up our page load method, let's go over to the code behind and see how we would add a handler here in C# to get this page load method to attach as the event handler for the page load event. In order to get this page load method attached to the load event for the page with auto event wire up set to false, we have to explicitly declare the event handler. So in order to do that, we need to put it somewhere. So let's put it in the onInit method. So we'll do protected override, and we'll go to the onInit, and what we'll do is we'll say this being the page dot load event, and we'll go plus equals, and we'll create a new event handler. We'll hit tab, and then instead of taking this underscore default underscore load, which is being suggested, we'll put page underscore load. So now this should attach the page load method as the event handler for the load event. So let's fire up the page in the debug mode, and as you can see, we do hit the page load method, let it run through, and we get the message on our page indicating that the page load method was called. The machine.config auto event wire up is set to true. So just to cover that, let's comment out this that we just put in here to explicitly attach the event handler. We'll go back over to the page and we'll take out auto event wire up equals false. So now we should fall back to the machine.config, and we'll fire up the web page in the debug mode, and as expected we do hit the page load method. So the difference here in C# is that if we want to explicitly attach an event handler, we don't have the handles keyword here on the actual method declaration. We have to assign an event handler somewhere else in our code, such as we did here in the onInit method. Now the last thing we need to look at with respect to the page events is that we've talked about the auto events wire up being an attribute here in the page element. It also can be placed in the web.config, and in the web.config that value would pertain to the entire website rather than just a single page. And as we saw, machine.config, that applies to all web applications under the current server or installation. So if we wanted to set it in the web.config, let's go into the config file for our C# project, and you would set it in the pages element under system.web. So if we add pages, and you'll see there is the auto event wire up attribute, and here you could set it to true or false. So those are the three options. You either fall back to the global machine.config value, which is true. You set it in the web.config so it applies to the entire web application, or you set it in the individual page. And it is applied in that order of precedence, in that the page, if it's set, will take precedence over web.config. Web.config takes precedence over machine.config. So now let's take a look at event handlers for web server controls, and to do that we're going to go back over and work on our VB project. So let me close down a couple of these windows. So to demonstrate how server controls do event handling, let's add a simple server control to our page. I'll go over into the design mode and we'll add a button to the page. Now by adding the server control to the page, we don't explicitly have any event handlers for our button yet. If we go into the source, you'll see there's the server control markup, and there's no indication of an event handler there. If we go back over to the code behind, we don't see any event handlers. Now, there's several approaches to creating event handlers for the server controls, and probably one of the more common is that people will just double click on, say, a button control, and what happens there is we automatically get a button1_click event handler generated. And if I scroll out here to the right, you'll see we have the handles button1.click event added to the end of the method declaration. Now if we go back over into our default page and go to the source view, you'll see our declarative syntax for the button control remains the same. So just to see that this works, let's go to our code behind it. In our button click event, let's take our message variable and let's say, the button is clicked or was clicked. And let's take our breakpoint off of page load and let's put one down here on line 12. And let's make our VB website the startup project. Now let's run the website, fire it up in the debug mode. Here's our button. When we click on the button, you do see that we are in the click event handler for the button. Let it run through, and we see our message was changed. Now there are a couple other approaches to assigning the event handlers for particular server controls. And what I'd like to do next is we're going to go over here and we're going to take out the handles from this button1_click, and actually to show that this is really different, let's call it button1_click. Let me copy that text because we're going to need that in just a moment. And now the second way you can attach an event handler, we're going to go over here to the declarative syntax, and in there we're going to go to the onClick event, and what we're going to put here in the tag or attribute onClick is the name of the method that we're mapping the onClick event to, and in this case it'll be button1_the_click. So we'll check, we still have our breakpoint. Let's fire up the web page in the debug mode. We'll click on the button, and indeed we're still attached to the button1_the_click, even though we don't have the handles on the end of it. In this case, we explicitly assigned it in the declarative syntax. Now the third way to assign the event handler is actually a variation on what we just did here in the declarative syntax. And let me go over to the code behind and we'll call this the click2. Going to go back over here, take out this onClick attribute in the button element. Let's go up in the design mode, and this is just a little more graphical way to do it. Go over into the properties window, and by default we're seeing the properties of the button control. If we click on the events button in the toolbar, we see the various events that are associated with the button control, and what we can do here is we can actually select any method in our code behind, and in this case we'll select button1_the_click2, and now that is assigned as the event handler for onClick. And in fact, if we go back over to the source code, we'll see that the declarative syntax remains the same. However, over in the code behind, what's happened is Visual Studio has added a handles button1_click to our method. So as expected, if we fire this up in the debug mode, click on our button, we will hit the event handler right here, and the text is substituted on the page. Now the other interesting thing we can do has to do with attaching the events for multiple controls to the same event handler. So to demonstrate that, let's go over to the default ASPX and let us add several buttons to the page. Go into the tool, add a couple more buttons. Now we have 3 buttons on the page. Go back to the source view. There are buttons 1, 2, and 3. Now let's go to our code behind, and what we can do is go over here And we can take this handles, and what we can do is we can say button2.click and button3.click. And so what's going to happen now is all three of those buttons, when any of them I should say is clicked, it's going to go to this particular method. So let's start up the web page again in the debug mode, and let's click on button number 3. You see we're down here in the event handler, button 2 in the event handler, as well as button 1. Now, one thing that's useful when you have an event handler that's a method I should say that's handling multiple events, you might want to know which button